It's really a privilege to be here and a pleasure to be here. I was a master's student here. I was amazed to discover 20 years ago and have barely been back since then, and so I just had such a lovely time walking around yesterday afternoon. It was a beautiful spring and I'm delighted to be here. So you will notice in the program, if you compare the title, I changed my title. And I changed my mind about what I wanted to talk about just a little bit. I thought I was going to focus on Catholics, and Catholics are still part of the story, but they're no longer sort of the focus of the story. So, so the new title, Race, Religious Freedom, and the Tri-Faith Movement. So, some of you may recognize this image, Norman Rockwell's iconic illustration of the freedom of worship, which was one of the 4 freedoms identified by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II, or right before America entered World War II, featuring a group of people with their eyes closed reverently and hands clasped in prayer. In the context of the Second World War, this painting conveyed a shared American commitment to faith and freedom, in contrast to the suppression of religious practice under totalitarian rule. Rockwell subtly identified several of these worshippers as Catholic or Jewish. The woman at center left is holding a rosary. The man at the bottom right wears what appears to be a yarmulke and holds an unspecified holy book in his hands. But from a 21st century perspective, this gesture towards diversity seems somewhat limited. Rockwell made no attempt to move beyond the tri-faith framework of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, which had already become the standard way to map religious diversity in American life. Even within that framework, his illustration assumed subtly Protestant norms, I would argue, for religious practice and the meaning of religious freedom. The worshippers' shared posture of side-by-side, but essentially individual prayer, suggests generally Protestant assumptions about prayer as an individual mode of communication with the divine. The phrase lettered across the top of the painting, each according to the dictates of his own conscience, likewise emphasized the primacy of individual faith. And finally, worshippers with no visually marked religious identity are probably presumed to be Protestant, revealing the normative quality of Protestantism in American life. Now, this is a less famous illustration of FDR's 4 freedoms. Some of you may recognize it, I don't know. It's a mural created by artist Hugo Ballin at the Burbank, California City Hall, not far from here. And it provides a different twist on the meaning of religious freedom. You see the second panel is the one representing religion and religious freedom. Like Rockwell's, Ballin's painting portrayed Americans as united in their commitment to religious faith, whatever tradition they embraced. But he gave far more weight to religious authority and tradition. He identified the large symbolic figure that dominated this panel. Let me zoom it in a little bit for you. Thank you, Patrick. Show me how to do that. As Moses, holding tablets of the law. Below Moses is the Pope with the regalia of his office. I guess it's a little, sorry, it's a little fuzzy here, but I think you can get the idea. A group of Jewish rabbis with a Torah and a ram's horn. A Protestant minister preaching from a pulpit to his congregants below. This is a tri-faith cast of authority figures again, but I would suggest it's more compatible with Catholic conceptions of the role of the church and the authority of the church than with the individual path to salvation that tends to be more associated with Protestant traditions. These 2 images thus hint at the competing Protestant and Catholic ideologies that structured the vast majority of religious freedom debates in 19th and 20th century America, which I'm not really going to be focusing on in my talk today, but I think it's important as a historian to kind of set the stage with reference to those conflicts. And I am kind of your obligatory history lesson for the morning, and then you can move on to more interesting things afterwards. By starting with Rockwell and Ballin, I'm also giving you a hint about my approach. Rather than a legal history or legal analysis of religious freedom, I am more interested in a kind of cultural history, thinking about how and when religious freedom gets invoked, by whom, and the range of the cultural work that this ideal performs. As Taylor mentioned, the book that I'm writing at the moment is titled Race, Empire, and American Religious Freedom. And it took me a long time to figure out what I was doing with this book, but it reflects my interests with how the sort of discourses of religious freedom, which I call religious freedom talk, intersect with politics of race and empire. I'm not going to be talking about empire as much today, although there's a lot of empire going around these days, I would say. But race is my focus, and I would suggest from that perspective that in a more subtle way, the Rockwell and Ballin images also hint that the barriers to religious freedom in American life were racial as well as religious. To their credit, both artists incorporated gestures of racial inclusivity. See if I can figure out how to get us back to the, I don't know how to get back, oh well, I don't know how to get back to the Rockwell image at this point. There we go, yes I do, okay, no, what happened? Sorry. There we go. I knew I could do it. Both artists incorporated gestures of racial inclusivity. Rockwell's freedom of worship illustration includes one African-American woman, almost off the top there. She is the only person of color, or the only one identifiably marked as such in any of his four freedoms. Rockwell later explained that he wanted this painting to, quote, make the statement that no man should be discriminated against regardless of his race or religion. But by presenting religious freedom as an unequivocal success story and referencing racial minorities only in that context, Rockwell offered a misleading impression of racial harmony that eluded the lived realities of racial segregation and violence for African Americans and other racial minorities at the time. For them, the ongoing realities of racism created a persistent barrier to freedom of all kinds, including the freedom of religion. Now, Ballin's freedom of worship panel referenced a very different racial minority, once again reflecting his regional location in the West. Visible near the bottom of the panel is a Native American man. See if you can see just down here. Described by the artist as protecting a flame, despite a rather stereotypical headdress, one that would have signified a Plains rather than a Pacific Coast tribal affiliation. Ballin seems to have wanted to honor the continued presence of Native peoples and traditions in California. But another Native American figure placed on the outside edge of the panel revealed a much more hostile reality. Ballin, describing the painting later, Ballin wrote, a savage back of the Pope is learning how to pray. If the first of these Indians granted a degree of religious legitimacy to Native people and traditions, the second honored the historic Spanish missions that had attempted to eliminate them. Ballin's derogatory word savage assigned Indians to an inferiority that was defined in simultaneously racial and religious terms. And in fact, Native Americans remained a subordinated people with very little meaningful access to the promise of religious freedom. Racism compounded religious bias so that Native Americans, along with African Americans and other racial minority groups, found it far more difficult than their white counterparts to claim the promise of religious freedom. The principle of religious freedom intersected with race in another way, I would argue. First Amendment, as we know, enshrined this freedom as an all-American ideal, one to which most Americans have paid homage ever since, however much they disagreed on precisely what it protected. To articulate a claim to religious freedom is also to assert a religious identity. But this is only one of several possible ways to define or categorize the identity of a people. There's a lot of theoretical scholarship in religious studies and critical race theory thinking about how racial and religious identities are always co-constituted, defined in terms of one another. And I would argue that in American history, debates over religious freedom and claims to religious freedom are one of the mechanisms by which racial and religious identity get negotiated. So I don't know if I'll be able to convince you of that in the next 15 minutes, but we'll see. Where was I? When they pursue claims to religious freedom, some minority groups who might otherwise see themselves or be seen by others as an ethnic or racial group might instead claim a religious definition of their communal identity. The American emphasis on religious freedom enabled certain groups, especially American Jews, but to some extent Catholic immigrants as well, and do a thought experiment, maybe think about other groups, to reclassify their identities in primarily religious rather than ethnic or racial terms. Once viewed as only marginally white, and certainly not Anglo-Saxon, these groups, Catholic and Jewish immigrants, could in this way locate themselves as primarily religious rather than racial minorities. This identification helped them escape some of the stigma of racial minority status, aiding their gradual absorption into the racial status of whiteness in American life. In this sense, the prominence of religious freedom in American public discourse helped facilitate the expansion of whiteness to include not just Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but most Catholics and Jews as well. The idea that Catholics and Jews were not necessarily seen as white, even in the early part of the 20th century, might seem counterintuitive to some of you. But the ideologies and classifications of race have changed significantly over time. There's a substantial scholarship now in the history of whiteness that demonstrates this. In the 19th century too, since this is in part of Mormon Studies Conference, it's worth pointing out Mormons too came to be defined as racially other. Paul Reed's new book is essential reading on this topic. And I haven't really done focused work on this question, but I wonder whether the Mormon emphasis on religious freedom in the 19th century, although obviously Mormons were not invoking it for this reason, had the effect of also helping to resist that racialization and support Mormon claims to whiteness. This was certainly true, I believe, for Jews and Catholics in the early 20th century, when race was really a fundamental organizing principle for American life, much as it remains in many ways today, but how race was configured was quite different then. Segregationist laws were being codified ever more strongly in the South under what was called Jim Crow. No way. Segregation, whoops, did I just turn off the light? Okay, light's on. The rates of lynching and anti-immigrant mob violence were on the rise. Ideologies of Anglo-Saxon racial triumphalism boosted the nation's imperial aggressions, and a growing number of nativist organizations and secret societies targeted immigrants all across the country, the Ku Klux Klan among them. And the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s really targeted Jewish and Catholic immigrants as much as it did African Americans, and defined them, it really spoke of them in racial terms. I've got some colorful quotes for this that I'm going to skip over. But in this context, the tri-faith movement, which began in this period, right, as an effort, dialogue between initially Protestants and Jews, and then drew Catholics into the story, spoke about religious freedom, really emphasized the history of religious freedom. And each of these three groups, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, all had their own reasons to emphasize this, this theme. Jews in particular, of course, were desperate to fend off a rising tide of racialized anti-Semitism in America as well as in Europe. In the 30s, the Nazi rise to power was especially alarming. American Jewish leaders were doing everything they could to advocate for German Jews, both in Germany and in efforts to open up immigration laws in the United States. I've got a chapter on this in my book. As the economic woes of the Great Depression intensified, American elites across religious lines became more and more worried about domestic social unrest and the threats of totalitarianism in the United States, as well as abroad. So by defining Americans as a people of faith, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, and you saw this in both the images of Rockwell and Ballin, tri-faith leaders forged alliances to resist the anti-religious forces that seemed poised to destroy them all. The tri-faith movement mostly succeeded in shaping mid-20th century public discourse towards a redefinition of American diversity as primarily a matter of religion, and of the barriers to intergroup harmony in the United States as products of mostly religious rather than racial difference. During the Second World War, the US government embraced tri-faith rhetorics and organizing schemes, both in its military chaplaincy operations and in a public relations campaign that celebrated American religion in tri-faith terms. That propaganda served effectively to contrast US democracy against the racial triumphalism of the Nazis. As the Cold War unfolded over the next few decades, the tri-faith framework would define Americans as both religious and free over and against the anti-religious totalitarianism of the Soviets. So, you know, we certainly, religious freedom is a hugely visible part of our public discourse today. It was also hugely visible during the Second World War and the Cold War. I think this history is important to keep in mind. What I'm arguing is that by focusing on religious freedom and framing American religion as Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, the tri-faith movement helped to counter the kind of stereotypes and depictions of these immigrant groups as non-Anglo-Saxon, non-white, brought them into kind of the mainstream America. But eliminating, you know, the Jews and Catholics by the end of the Second World War in America had been basically reclassified in the public imaginary, not always on the ground, and it's more complicated. You know, I can't go into all the complexities right now, but basically are imagined as white. But eliminating an older, this then has the effect, I would argue, of, you know, you're expanding the category of whiteness. On the one hand, whiteness is no longer just sort of Anglo-Saxon, or they talk about the Normans. Whiteness includes this whole array of European immigrants. That has the effect then of reinforcing or strengthening the kind of black-white racial binary. So rather than having all these gradations of race as Americans understand race, there's more of a black-white binary. This drawback was quite evident to African-American observers at the time. In one editorial titled "Tolerant Ostriches," the African-American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, commented on a traveling discussion unit organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, composed of a rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister. I'm going to take just a couple more minutes, I'm sorry. The Courier noted that despite the lynching and ruthless exploitation and shameless discrimination against the colored folk, no Negro is a member of this discussion unit. While these nice liberals, the editors commented, were eager to tackle the bigotries of religion, they had nothing to say about the worst intolerance of all, color prejudice. Pittsburgh Courier had no doubt that Jews, Catholics, and Protestants active in the NCCJ were all racially white. And its editorial image of the ostrich implied that the tri-faith concern for religious freedom had the effect of obscuring the more intractable racial barriers in American life. The activities of the Interdenominational Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs gives a more concrete example of how an exclusive emphasis on religious freedom could help white Americans avoid the problem of race. Organized in the 1930s to lobby for persecuted Baptists abroad, the BJC immediately identified the historic Baptist ideal of religious freedom as its primary sphere of interest. During the Second World War, when several predominantly black Baptist denominations were invited to participate in the work of the committee, an African-American delegate proposed that the scope of the public affairs promised by the organization's title should include the problem of racial discrimination. The other delegates approved this proposal in principle, but then at the same meeting closed off that possibility by passing a resolution that from now on the BJC, quote, should concern itself primarily with the question of making effective the Baptist position on religious liberty in the post-war peace settlement. Tackling the problem of racism would have alienated much of the Baptist Joint Committee's white constituency, especially in the South in the 1940s. Yet, an exclusive focus on religious freedom allowed the committee to maintain its tentative and always fragile collaboration between white Northern and white Southern Baptists. Yet, in so doing, by focusing exclusively on religious freedom as the meaning of public affairs, the BJC avoided taking up the concerns that were most pressing to black Baptist churches. For that reason, over the course of the next 2 decades, the black Baptist denominations rarely bothered to send delegates to its meetings. In this way, the focus on religious freedom helped white Americans avoid problems of racism, I would argue, and mostly excluded African Americans themselves from the conversation. Some white Americans also invoked religious freedom in ways that directly justified racial discrimination and the legal regimes of segregation, by arguing essentially that, as pro-slavery advocates had done in the 19th century, in the middle of the 20th century, advocates for racial segregation argued that this was God's divine plan and that to interfere with it was a violation of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, as well as other individual liberties. The meaning of religious freedom in American life changed in many ways during the second half of the 20th century. Many of you know that history very well, the legal history. Through all these debates, the racial limits to freedom remained very much in place. Historian Randall Ballmer has argued that a big part of the organizing impetus for the religious right in the 1970s and 80s was to defend white privilege against the successes of the civil rights movement. The new conservative evangelical mobilization of those decades reacted not immediately against Roe v. Wade, as popular versions of its history have assumed, but first of all against the IRS move to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University for its policies of racial segregation on campus. Jerry Falwell's rallying cry of religious freedom served as a way to defend de facto segregation under a post-civil rights regime, especially in the private Christian schools that were founded across the South as a refuge from newly desegregated public schools. Given the racial politics outlined here, it's not surprising that black Christians rarely found the vision of the new religious right or its rallying cry of religious freedom to be especially compelling. All right, conclusion, I promise. The history I've charted here unsettles more familiar narratives of American religious freedom as an unequivocal success story, It's my hope that understanding the subtle racial and religious norms that have limited it may help inspire a more capacious and inclusive approach to this freedom, but also greater humility on the part of its advocates. Religious freedom is likely to remain in place as a fundamental American ideal, and I'm not among those who believe that we would be better off without it. But perhaps with a fuller understanding of its history and the complexity of its cultural impact, we can push towards new formulations of this freedom that will be less likely to privilege particular forms of religion or to privilege the rights of religion over other forms of freedom and justice, or over that other American ideal of equality for all. Thank you.